for this next discussion.
Wonderful.
Item 8.
I think of all we're talking about, I'm really excited about this presentation. State Board, Sean McGuire, welcome. Glad you're with us, and as well as our state lawyers who are also going to be part of this presentation. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Madam Chair and members of the board. Always a pleasure to be here for my regular State Board liaison update to you. And yes, you're right. Today, we're really going to focus our conversation on racial equity challenges that we've been facing in our state and frankly in our nation. And I'm always available to talk and answer any other questions you may have as it relates to state board activities. But today I just really felt it important to focus on this topic in particular. So, as you know, we all know that this has just been an incredibly significant year in raising all of our awareness as to just the racial injustice that occurs in our country. Most signified by the police violence that we've seen in the wake of the George Floyd killing and many others that we've seen in the news and heard about over the recent months, and frankly it has been going on for many years and decades. And so your board discussed these events over at a board meeting over the summer and asked me to come back with an update as to what the state board is doing to address racial inequity. And the answer at that time was we had a number of initiatives underway, but there's a lot more that we could do. And so I'm really happy to come back today to report that we're continuing to dig in and build momentum in this area. And it really is a high priority and focus for our organization, the state board at CalEPA, the administration, and also, of course, with you and all the regional boards. A couple of weeks ago, we also held, I think was mentioned earlier today by a board member, the Water Quality Coordinating Committee meeting, which is a meeting of all the regional board members and state board members to discuss common issues amongst ourselves at the water boards. We had about a 4-hour focus session to discuss racial equity challenges. And I know a number of you were there, and I know not all of you were able to attend, and that's completely understandable. But I really found it to be a fantastic discussion. We had breakout groups. We had some excellent mentoring and guidance from some of our leadership at CalEPA, and just a phenomenal discussion for me personally, as someone who admittedly has been learning a great deal over the last few months about this. And this is an issue that I really have taken to heart, has really affected me personally, just in terms of how I need to think more comprehensively and inclusively about racial equity as it comes up in the different policy decisions and different actions that I am making decisions on as a state board member. And I'm sure you feel the same way too at the regional board. And so, today what I really want to do is hand this discussion over to Adriana Renteria, who's our director of the Office of Public Participation at the State Water Board, and Sophie Froelich, who you know, who is not only in the Office of Chief Counsel and represents your region, but both of them are also on our steering committee for our new racial equity initiative. And so they're going to talk to you a bit, some of what was discussed at the Water Quality Coordinating Committee meeting a couple weeks ago, but also just to help carry the conversation specifically here to the Los Angeles region and facilitate a discussion with you for what you can be doing. So with great pleasure, I think I'm going to hand this now over to Adriana, I believe.
Thanks so much, Board Member McGuire, and thanks so much, board members, for inviting us today. Good morning. My name is Adriana Renteria. I'm the Director for the Office of Public Participation, and my pronouns are she and they. And like Board Member McGuire mentioned, I'm here with my colleague, Sophie Frolick, attorney with the Office of Chief Counsel. And Sophie and I are here representing the Water Boards Racial Equity Steering Committee. So the Racial Equity Steering Committee and the Racial Equity Working Group combined represent over 30 water board staff from across the regions, divisions, and offices, as well as CalEPA representatives who are working to advance racial equity at the water boards. Today, you're going to be hearing about the Racial Equity Steering Committee and Working Group, as well as the goals, priorities, and upcoming efforts of the group. We'll also be taking the moment today to do a brief grounding on what we mean by racial equity and walking through our theory of change. So those of you who participated in the WQCC, a lot of that will be sort of a refresher. And then lastly, we'll wrap up our update with Renee Purdy sharing a little bit more about racial equity efforts taking place specifically at the LA Regional Water Board. So we can go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. Okay. So to begin, the goal for the Water Board's Racial Equity Initiative is really to address systemic, institutional, and individual racism throughout our organization and in the communities that we serve. So we're aiming to achieve this goal by evaluating and modifying our internal and external practices, looking at our actions, and also looking at our outcomes of our work. One of our first milestones to achieve this goal are to develop and adopt racial equity resolutions and related action plans. So Sophie will talk a little bit more later on, but just to mention, this is kind of the goal and what we're working towards. So next slide, please. So before we jump into specifically what's taking place at the water boards, we wanted to first provide a grounding for why we're doing this work. Why are we talking about race, racism, and racial equity? So as a government agency whose responsibility is to serve all Californians and to ensure all Californians have access to safe and affordable drinking water and to all beneficial uses of water, it's really important for us to be asking ourselves these questions. Questions like, which communities have benefited the most from our policies and programs? Which communities have experienced the most disproportionate burden from our policies, regulations, or programs? And how can the water boards relook at our existing policies and programs in order to support more equitable access for all? But in order for us to begin to answer these questions and to think about how we may address some of those disparities, we need to first understand how race and power influences our work at the water boards. So what is race and racism? An analogy I like to share comes from John A. Powell from the Institute of Othering and Belonging. And he uses the analogy that race is like diamonds. So the value and meaning of race and diamonds are both social constructs, and the assignment of that value and meaning both have ramifications on people's lives. So even though race is a socio-political construct used to group people, that construct has significant impact on a person's life and their life outcomes. Racism is the combination of prejudice and power. And racism is prejudice against someone because of their race. This prejudice, when you combine it with systems of power, is what leads to different groups experiencing different outcomes, consequences, benefits, or disadvantages, just because of the racial group that they are assigned to. This leads to white groups experiencing more advantages in comparison to Black, Indigenous, or people of color. So next slide, please. So racism manifests itself in many different spheres in our lives, and it takes many different forms. Today, we're going to talk through 3 different forms, including interpersonal, institutional, and structural racism. So individual or interpersonal racism is racism or bias or discrimination that's based on an individual's race. So for example, this is racism that occurs on an interpersonal level, where we have personal racial beliefs that affect our interactions with one another. So what this can look like is it can look like telling a racist joke or even making certain hiring decisions. This is what happens between 2 people on an individual or interpersonal level. Institutional racism, that's what includes policies, practices, procedures that work better for white people than they do for Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And oftentimes, this institutional racism is unintentional and it's inadvertent. And this is really where water board policies fit in, at the institutional level. This is how redlining policies affect which racial groups are able to purchase homes in certain areas, and how environmental hazards are often located near low-income communities of color. So these institutional policies, they may never mention a specific racial group, but what happens is that these institutional policies create and maintain accumulated advantages for white people, and they fail to address accumulated disadvantages for people of other racial groups. And the last one is structural racism. So structural racism really encompasses our history and our current reality of all of the institutional racisms combined. So if you join all of the different institutions and look at how the accumulated disadvantages or the accumulated advantages stack up, this is what the dynamic process of structural racism is. The presence of structural racism, we can see it when we compare different outcomes. So whether you're looking at the outcome of education attainment, family wealth, or access to safe and affordable clean drinking water, all of these outcomes can be correlated with the race of a community. So these different facets of racism, the individual, institutional, and structural racism, all of these different facets really work interactively to reinforce a system that racializes outcomes. And the reason why we're focusing on racism is because we recognize that the creation of government itself perpetuates racial inequalities. So racism has essentially been baked into our government here in the United States and in many other nations across the world. We also want to recognize that many other groups of people are also marginalized. People are marginalized because of their gender, sexual orientation, their ability, their age, their religion, just to name a few. But right now, for this effort, we're focusing specifically on race and racial equity, because when we focus on racial equity, that creates an opportunity for us to introduce a framework, to introduce tools and resources that we can then apply to other aspects of marginalization. So we just want to recognize that there are many things that affect a community or an individual's outcomes, but race in particular is what we're focusing on here. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that we understand the different levels of racism, what is the relationship between race and government? Why are we as a government agency talking about race? So once again, racism and race has been baked into government policies and decision-making from the beginning. The history of government itself and racism can be told in 3 different phases. So in the first phase, government was initially explicit in its racial oppression. So government passed and enforced laws that determined things like who could vote, who could be a citizen, who could own property, who was considered property, whose land was whose, where you could live, who you could marry, whose military service would be honored and whose would not, and many other additional factors. Fortunately, over time, we've had the passage of the 13th Amendment, the 14th and 15th, which ended slavery and ensured that formerly enslaved people were entitled to equal protection under the US laws, and also ensured that Black men could vote. Later, we had the 19th Amendment, where women could vote, Brown versus Board of Education, and the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So all of these really significant milestones that our government saw, all of these changes were really taking place, not because government decided one day that they wanted to address these injustices. All of these significant changes in our government laws and policies really came to be because people came together in mass protests, because people came together using tactical coalitions, and really pushed the government to better align their values. And so what we want to highlight here is that these changes were not passive. These changes had to happen through active public participation and active civic engagement. So in the second phase of government racism becomes explicit. So after making some progress, we come into a phase in government where we enter into race neutrality. And though we're not making explicit racial discrimination laws, there are still laws that are creating inequity. And if we want to make progress, we need to work on reducing that racial inequity. And that third phase of government history is where we're at now. So we're in an era where people in government are making concerted efforts to transform government from the inside out, where governments across the nation are really being proactive in developing policies and practices that address the history of injustice and advance racial equity. So here at the Water Boards and at CalEPA, we're part of the Government Alliance for Racial Equity, which is a network of different government entities that are working to apply an equity analysis to our work to create better outcomes for everybody. So next slide, please. Yeah, we can keep on going next. Next slide, please. Thank you. So our participation in the Government Alliance for Racial Equity is especially important given the way that race influences a community's access to healthy environments. So this slide shows information from CalEnviro screen, and the slide shows that the top 10% of least polluted neighborhoods are 72% white, while the top 10% of most polluted neighborhoods are 89% people of color. And when it comes to access to safe and affordable drinking water, we see a similar outcome with low-income communities of color disproportionately burdened with unsafe drinking water. We go on to the next slide, please. So what can we do about this? How can we address these injustices? That's where racial equity comes in. So we want to clearly define what the terms diversity, inclusion, and equity are, and clarify that they are different. So diversity refers to various characteristics and ways that individuals or groups are different from one another. So people are not diverse. If we can go to the back slide, please. People are not diverse. Groups of people are diverse. Groups or collectives can be diverse. So for example, a candidate that you may interview, a candidate is not diverse. A candidate is a unique individual, but you may have a group of candidates or a candidate pool that is diverse. And that candidate pool may include many different candidates with different identities. Inclusion, on the other hand, it means authentically bringing traditionally excluded people into processes, activities, and decision-making in a way that actually shares power. Inclusion means really valuing each individual or group's heritage or contributions in a way that really creates a sense of belonging for everybody. One thing to note is that inclusion doesn't just happen naturally just because an organization or a group is diverse. It is something that also has to be actively created and cultivated. Equity, on the other hand, recognizes that because different individuals or groups have had different histories, and because different individuals or groups have had different life circumstances, not all of us are starting at the same starting place. And when we use an equity approach, individuals and groups receive different resources or support based on their specific needs. And when we provide individuals or groups the resources that they need based on their specific needs, we can then create an opportunity for equal or fair outcomes. So racial equity is the condition that is achieved when race is no longer used to predict the life outcomes, and where all groups have access to safe environments and access to safe and affordable drinking water. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So how are we bringing racial equity into our work? So what you're seeing on the slide right here is the Government Alliance for Racial Equity's theory of change. And what you can see is that this is a circular and ongoing theory of change that begins with, number one, normalizing conversations around racial equity. Then number two, organizing structures and building capacity to address racial equity. And lastly, operationalizing this change within our policies, practices, and programs. So the conversation that we're having here today with all of you is part of that normalizing process. We're talking about racial equity, and we will continue talking about racial equity and build everybody's comfort around this topic. The work that Sophie's going to be talking about next is really going to be addressing how we're organizing our staff and building the capacity of our staff to then operationalize our work. So next slide, please. So just digging deeper into these phases, during the normalized phase, we're using a shared racial equity framework, and we're operating with urgency and accountability. When we move into the organizing phase, we're building organizational capacity for racial equity, and we're partnering with organization and community members to make sure that we're listening to the communities that we serve and to make sure that we're on the right track. And when we operationalize, we're implementing racial equity tools. We are data and metrics driven. We are clearly defining our goal and measuring our progress, just like we do with all of our other efforts in our programs. So as you can see, this theory of change is cyclical, and it repeats itself as we continue to apply it to different aspects of our work. So this right here concludes our brief grounding and our framing on racial equity and our theory of change. Next, I'm going to pass the mic to Sophie, who's going to walk us through how the water boards are actually implementing this theory of change. So if you can go on to the next slide, please.
Good morning. So building on what CalEPA has done and what Adriana has presented, in August 2020, the water boards formally launched their racial equity initiative. As Eileen Sobek, the executive officer of the state board, has stated, one of the most critical challenges facing us at this time is the challenge of achieving racial equity. And the moment requires us to respond and implement changes internally as an organization and in our external facing programs. The racial equity initiative priorities include establishing a foundation of internal and external engagement that values listening and collaboration to drive action, drafting, vetting, and finalizing a resolution on racial equity to be considered for adoption by the state board and also leveraged by regional boards to adopt their own resolutions. Importantly, the resolutions are a starting point and not the end point. We will tee off the resolutions then to develop racial equity strategies and action plans to drive our efforts for the coming years. The regional boards, which interface directly with the public via regularly scheduled meetings like this one, inspections and permitting and cleanup actions and otherwise, will be a very important part of the initiative. Eventually, they will be the so-called boots on the ground. Next slide, please. So to support the racial equity initiative, the water boards have formed a racial equity steering committee and a racial equity working group. The steering committee is made up of representatives from the HR department, the Office of Public Participation, the Santa Ana Regional Water Board, Office of Information Management, Office of Chief Counsel, and decision makers at the water boards and CalEPA, among others. The steering committee is accountable for overseeing program processes, implementation, and the overall success of the initiative. They are responsible for facilitating and leading the working groups too. The working group is made up of a wide cross-section of water board staff, as Adriana explained, and that's including administrative staff to high-level managers from all of the water board's divisions and departments. They will solicit feedback and recommendations on key focus areas from water board staff and external partners such as community advocacy groups, nonprofit, faith-based organizations, academics and others. And they will develop and draft short and long-term work plans and will work with the water boards to draft the state board's racial equity resolution. And they will also work with the water board staff to implement identified actions and changes in alignment with the state board's racial equity resolution and the regional water board's racial equity resolutions. Next slide, please. So this slide explains a bit more about the relationship between the steering committee and the working group, as well as how we envision the first big deliverable, the state and regional water boards racial equity resolutions will come about. So as an initial matter, The working group with both the State Board's Office of Public Participation and the Office of Information Management will be conducting external and internal listening and learning sessions to determine what the communities we serve and what our staff would like to see the water boards commit to in terms of racial equity. The working group will take the feedback and recommendations from the state and regional water board members, from staff, and from the external partners, and it will examine internal and external data and references, and it will ultimately draft the racial equity resolution for the state board. The steering committee will bring the draft racial equity resolution to the state board, and we currently anticipate doing so in the spring of 2021. The regional boards too will be considering their own racial equity resolutions thereafter. Next slide, please. So in terms of resources internally, you may already be familiar with the new racial equity resources on WaterNet, but in case you are not, there are new resources for you, including SharePoint sites with different documents and things you can read about for education on the topic of racial equity. There are some films, I believe, a list of steering committee members, and other useful information. As you have probably heard, here in Region 4, Hugh Marley is part of the DMC's Racial Equity and Environmental Justice Subcommittee, and I am on the Water Board Steering Committee. And the Steering Committee and the DMC's Racial Equity and Environmental Justice Subcommittee will be working closely together in implementing all of these initiatives. Therefore, please feel free to ask us any questions and think of Hugh and myself as resources for you on this matter. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier, and Adriana did too, the public listening sessions. We will be hosting several of them, and obviously they'll be virtual. The goal of these listening sessions, again, is to receive feedback and suggestions that will be used to inform our racial equity resolution and other initiatives and actions that we will be taking. And we will facilitate guided small group discussions on topics such as capacity building, workforce development, language access, and several other topics. The sessions are going to be taking place on the 30th of November and the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of December. Again, these are the public listening sessions, and if you are interested in attending any of these listening sessions, please reach out to Renee, and she and I will work together to make sure you're invited. Now I will hand the presentation back to Adriana. Next slide, please.
Awesome. Thanks, Sophie. So like Sophie mentioned, one of our first milestones is drafting this racial equity resolution. And we just wanted to offer some tools and resources to you all. The first resource we wanted to offer is some examples of racial equity resolutions that have been passed by other government agencies. So we just want to highlight through this that we're really not alone in this effort. There are multiple government agencies who've already passed their own racial equity resolutions. Some of these include the California Air Resources Control Board, who are part of our CalEPA family. They passed their racial equity and social justice resolution in October, so it's pretty recent. The San Francisco Public Utilities Commission and the Strategic Growth Council are two other agencies who've passed similar resolutions of their own. And a number of other cities have also joined this group, including the city of Los Angeles and the city of Long Beach. So really across the state and the nation, government agencies are really proactively addressing these centuries of historic injustices. So as we move forward, just know that we're not alone. Know that we're part of a larger effort that's taking place across the nation, and know that many community and advocacy groups have been advocating for this change for a very, very long time. So fortunately, there's a lot of resources and a lot of experts that we can turn to as we continue this work. In terms of data tools, we wanted to highlight two resources. One is workforce demographic data visualization, where you could take a look at staff demographics for the water boards and compare them to other CalEPA boards, departments, or offices. And the second is a linguistic isolation visualization tool, where you're able to identify linguistic isolation by census tract and in different California cities. Both of these tools are in development, but if you have any questions about this data or how to interpret it, feel free to reach out to Sophie or myself and we can connect you with more info. And the last resource on this is our Advancing Racial Equity at CalEPA through Train the Trainer effort. So CalEPA has a Train the Trainer program. So if any of your staff are interested in receiving or leading a training, you can contact Sophie or myself and we can help connect your staff with that opportunity to learn more. Next slide. All right, so the last tool that we wanted to mention is specifically for you board members, which is the tool of inquiry for equity and justice. So this tool of inquiry is a tool that you all as board members use quite often and quite well. And it's a tremendous, it's a tool that has tremendous power, really. You have the ability to exercise this tool whenever you have board briefings, whenever you are during your board meetings like this one, and maybe during your annual board retreat. Some of the questions that you can consider using is when anyone brings forward a proposal or a project, and you're looking at the data of that proposal or the project, you can ask questions like, what are the racial demographics in the geographic area identified? Are there any racial inequities present? If so, what caused those inequities? When looking at the impacts of a proposal, you can ask questions like, which communities or stakeholders are most impacted or burdened by this proposal? Which communities or stakeholders benefit the most? Are there ways this proposal can increase racial equity? When you're looking at how does this proposal share power, you can ask, which communities or stakeholders have been engaged in the development of this proposal? How can communities and stakeholders be involved in decision making? Are there opportunities for collaboration or partnership with local groups that would maximize positive impacts? So as you begin incorporating these questions into your discussions, there's going to be times where staff do not have answers for you. Know that that's okay. Just by bringing these questions into the conversation, you are already beginning to shift the culture. And eventually, over time, asking these questions will happen naturally, the same way that it's natural for you to ask questions about the fiscal or environmental impacts of a project or proposal. So we just wanted to offer these as tools. We're looking forward to hearing what other tools you as board members are currently using or would like to share with each other. And next, we're going to pass the mic to Renee Purdy, who's going to walk us through some of the specific efforts that are taking place regarding racial equity at the LA Regional Water Board. So next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Adriana and Sophie. As Adriana said, I'd like to take just a few minutes to talk about some of the initiatives at the Los Angeles Regional Board to address racial equity and related to that, diversity and inclusion overall, in addition to our participation in some of the broader statewide efforts that they both described to you. We in the Los Angeles region are strongly committed to diversity and inclusion in the workplace and our role in addressing racial inequities in our region, and are recommitting to our efforts to achieve and maintain this through our workforce planning, which includes recruitment, support for staff retention, development, and promotion, and efforts to ensure that our staff thrive and know that they are embraced and valued in the region. We're evaluating the results of an agency-wide employee engagement survey that I think I've mentioned to all of you from earlier this year. And we're also going to be looking closely at the survey results from a CalEPA survey on racial equity that was conducted recently that staff participated in. To help us grow in our actions to ensure a culture of inclusion within the Los Angeles region, and also a heightened awareness of how our words and actions can either build up or break down this culture of inclusion within our office. We're also strongly supporting and encouraging staff to engage in training on diversity and inclusion and racial equity. Specifically, we have all been taking training over the last several months on implicit bias, as well as ongoing training on discrimination and harassment prevention within our office. We're also in the process of working with the California Environmental Protection Agency and a couple members of our Racial Equity Steering Committee to schedule a series of trainings and facilitated discussions on racial equity for all Region 4 staff later this year. and also a compilation of resources, some of which Adriana was just showing you, for us to use in our decision making, some educational resources as well as some data resources that we can use when we're thinking about prioritization and specific decisions that we're making. And of course, we're going to continue to implement and evaluate our policies that promote diversity and inclusion in the workplace and racial equity, including the policy that we have statewide for zero tolerance for all forms of discrimination, harassment, and workplace violence, policies to ensure inclusion of those with disabilities, and plans and policies related to our workforce planning, as I mentioned earlier. And I want to just spend the last couple minutes switching to what we're doing, also looking more externally in the work that we're doing with communities across the Los Angeles region to ensure racial equity. We're recommitting ourselves to our efforts in this area, and we're doing this in a couple of ways: by examining our priorities within programs, our individual decisions, as well as our decision-making processes, meaning our outreach and engagement, to ensure that in each of these areas, we're doing what is within our power to address the environmental injustices that stem from racial inequities in the region. For example, we are considering how our permitting, our cleanup, and our enforcement activities can most effectively address these environmental injustices that have resulted from systemic and institutional racism. And as we consider this, we are also continuing to work on our outreach and engagement with communities that have suffered from this racism. Our objectives are to lower barriers to access to our decision-making processes, to support participation in our decision-making, and to collaborate with these communities and supporting organizations to identify ways that our decisions can increase racial equity in the realm of water quality and public health within the Los Angeles region. So a few examples I wanted to give you of some of these initial efforts include increasing language access, both in some of our written materials. For example, some of the materials we've been working with State Board on preparing related to implementation of SB 205, also increasing language access to board meetings and public meetings, such as the meeting today, for which we have Spanish interpretation, increased outreach and engagement with tribal governments, and also providing more information to these communities impacted by systemic racism to, like I said, increase engagement and outreach about who we are and what we do, and to address their concerns within their communities. And I just want to echo what State Board Member McGuire, I think, generally referred to at the beginning, which is that we understand that this is a path we've been on for some time and we will continue to be on for some time to come. And there is a lot to be done. But I want to wrap up by saying that and I think I can speak for Hugh and Jenny as well, look forward with hope to working with our team of staff in our region, all of you, the communities we serve, and also State Board through this racial equity initiative to strive to do our best as an organization to help make progress in redressing the racial inequities within our region and across the state. And I think we will, I hope, have an opportunity to continue this discussion, not only today, but as I think Adriana and Sophie referred to, potentially at our annual retreat in January, possibly thinking about what we might want a resolution to look like for our region, as well as what we want to do in terms of priority setting in the coming year. And Chair Munoz, with that, I would like to wrap up my comments and this presentation. And I did want to make sure that we took an opportunity to see if any of those participating in the meeting today via Zoom would like to make any comments on this item, and then would like to open the floor to questions and discussion from the board members about this item.
Okay, wonderful. So let's see if any of our participants would like to make comments or have questions.
So let me just take a look, and I also asked for a little assistance. This is part of our State Board Liaison Report. I know it's not our tradition necessarily to take comments as part of this, but certainly this item is one for which we do want to seek the input of our communities, our stakeholders, our permittees, and there will be future opportunities, as Sophie and Adriana discussed, through listening sessions that will be happening in the near future. Right now, I am not seeing any hands raised. I don't think from the attendees in the meeting, so I can check again later. So perhaps we can go ahead and start with any questions or discussion from the board, and I'll keep an eye on the attendees to see if anybody raises their hand later.
Okay, great. Board members, are there any comments or questions?
Just have a quick question. First of all, so thank you. This is really extraordinary work. Back in the 90s, I served for several years on the National Environmental Justice Council on behalf of EPA. And I'm just curious, I've sort of lost track of what they're up to, but I'm curious as to what extent what they're doing serves as any kind of a model for what we might do. Back when I was on that committee, there was a lot of outreach. We traveled all over the country to meet in different communities, to hear from community members about issues, and then would bring them back and develop either specific action items for those communities, and sometimes more broad policy action items for the agency as a whole. And it was when I was involved, we were getting quite a bit of traction. I have no idea what's going on with it now. I suspect probably not a whole lot, given who's in charge right now. But I'm just wondering if that sort of really extensive community outreach, going into communities, holding those meetings, is something that's sort of on your radar, and it's very time and resource intensive. But when I was involved, I found it incredibly useful, and I think the agency got a lot from it, and we developed quite a few policies from those efforts.
So I am not, Adriana, thank you. I see you unmuted. To be honest, I'm not aware of the full scope of what US EPA is doing right now. I did have the opportunity to participate in a recent brown bag seminar as to some of what continues to go on in terms of what they're doing inwardly. Through, for example, one of the things they were highlighting is the use and the convening of affinity groups to just really make sure that there is a culture of inclusion within the agency. And I know that that is continuing, and it's something that we at CalEPA, all the boards, departments, and offices are in the process of setting up within CalEPA as well. So I'm aware of that one example, but I bet Adriana knows probably more about what's going on.
Yeah, well, I'm actually similarly not as tapped into what's happening at the US EPA level. I think our involvement has been more at the CalEPA. And what's really interesting in what's happening at CalEPA is all of the different boards, divisions, and offices are doing a similar effort that the water boards are doing, with developing a similar task force. Everyone's sort of approaching it in their own different style. Some people are doing community focus groups. Some people have already passed resolutions. So at the CalEPA level, there's a really big momentum. And I think at the upcoming all staff meeting that's taking place on November 20th, a big part of that focus is to talk about at a California-wide level, what are we doing at CalEPA? So I think our engagement has mainly been at the state level, but I'd be curious to do some research. So thanks for bringing that up.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the efforts, when I was involved, the efforts were very external, really about impacts in various communities and environmental justice issues around those. I recall, it was a long time ago, but I recall reflecting that we needed to turn the attention inward as well, to make sure that the organization was reflecting, the same values that we wanted to be reflected in, what EPA was doing, mm-hmm. and it is supposed to be doing, which is, doing cleanups and those sorts of things, and it's under its various programs. So obviously your presentation, your attention was mostly internal, which is obviously critically important, but how that sort of integrates with the external efforts, I think is equally important.
Mhm, mhm. Yes, and I think that's where, I think through the Racial Equity Initiative, if I can jump in, Sophie and Adriana, it's very much meant to be both looking at what we can do internally, but absolutely what we can do externally within our authorities to try to address racial inequities related to water quality and public health. And there's some very powerful, Adriana just gave you a little sort of teaser about some of the data tools, but there's a lot of powerful information that our Office of Environmental Management, we call it OEMA, up at State Board, is pulling together that, for example, looks at red line data and pollution burden data that we can then use to then overlay on some of the information as to where we have sites that need attention for cleanup, where our permitting is done, where enforcement actions are being taken, to really look, and that's why I mentioned prioritization, is using some of those data tools to really make sure that we are focusing our efforts in a way, or prioritizing in a way that can help address some of those inequities.
Great, thank you.
Sophie?
So, and Board Member Stringer, to one of your points, in terms of our internal focused efforts, we will also be holding internal listening sessions. I think I mentioned it very briefly, but didn't focus on it because they haven't been scheduled yet. But we anticipate at this point they'll probably be held in January. We are mobilizing those efforts right now. I'm actually working with the Racial Equity Working Group's internal working group. We've divided into two. One is internal, one is external, and I'm working with them, and we're mobilizing that effort right now. And when those end up being held, we will of course inform you and let you know what the outcomes of that is as well. And once I think Adriana mentioned, or perhaps it was Renee, the racial equity survey that was done throughout CalEPA. Once that data is actually analyzed, we can also let you know what that showed as well. So.
Additional comments from board members?
Chair Munoz, Board Member Stahl, now I see you lowered your hand. Did you have a comment that you would like to make? You're on mute. There you go.
We can't.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, you can.
I was a strong advocate for posting on our website the technical issues related to the ubiquitous nature of PFAS. And in the same vein, I think this discussion, which followed along the lines of the Water Quality Coordinating Council discussions that we had, which were excellent. I think this one, more focused on Region 4, should also be posted to be able to show the public, and particularly inner city communities, disadvantaged communities, that there are issues that are not only technical, but in a very diverse society, unfortunately, that we live in now, that there is certainly our attempt, our positive attempt, to be able to address the issues of diversity and bringing people together. And so I think it's just as important, in fact, maybe more important, to have that posted on our website as it is an educational tool for PFAS.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And I do want to say just, I don't think I followed up on that recommendation from before. Some of you know that we do have a YouTube channel now, Region 4 does. And so we will start to have the opportunity to post some of these meetings on the Region 4 YouTube channel. For example, the October 15th workshop that we have, that we had on the MS4 permit is posted on our YouTube channel. And so we'll be able to post things like this, Board Member Stahl, and make sure that people know how to access those.
Well, I think I wanted it posted, or what I was suggesting was at least you give directions to or post it on our website so that they can get to the YouTube channel.
Yes, I understand.
Yeah.
We will make sure
Yeah.
that it's clear. How do you get to the YouTube channel for those that don't realize?
Exactly. And most importantly, how they listen to this discussion.
Yes, absolutely.
Vice Chair Yi.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was just checking to see if my mic was on. I find it ironic that this presentation and discussion follows right on the heels of our PFAS presentation discussion, because racism is just as toxic, just as insidious and ubiquitous, and just as harmful as a whole family of toxic chemicals. And what has struck me about this presentation today is how nice it's been, because I think we have to acknowledge how really difficult this is going to be, how really difficult, the work is ahead of us. And it's going to require really strong and undaunted leadership and a lot of courage. If we really intend to make some progress and make a difference. This election had an incredible impact on me. I really hit kind of an all-time low a couple of days after the election. And I'm just now kind of getting to a little bit better place. But it really demonstrated to me how deeply rooted systemic racism is in this country. And I'm talking about a taproot that's very broad and very deep. And let's be honest, folks, in large measure, we're talking about white privilege, white supremacy, and all of that equals white power. And it became very clear to me that people just are not going to be willing to cede power. Just are not. And so I think the new narrative that we have to begin to write is about sharing and balancing power. And I think that will help us get to a better place. I could go on, and I really am looking forward to the retreat that we're going to have in January when we focus on racial equity. But let me just end by saying that the slide that was used at WQCC, I think it was Yana who was making the presentation, but the cover slide that she used for her presentation, where it said everyone is welcome, I think we should get a copy of that slide and use that as a backdrop for a lot of our meetings and a lot of our work going forward. And I guess the very last thing I would say, if in fact the arc of the universe does bend toward justice, what I know now, and especially as a result of this election, it bends awfully slowly. And so I think, we're going to have a lot of patience, And I really hope this time, because I've been around the block with this stuff a lot, that we are able to get below the surface, not just deal with this racism thing, on a superficial level, but begin to get down below the surface and get to the real work at hand. And I have a lot of hope that we can do that.
Thank you. Board Member Guzman.
Thank you. I don't think I could top what Larry just said. I think Larry kind of captured it all. So thanks, Larry. Preach. I co-sign everything that he said. I guess reflecting on my other hat as an urban planner and consultant, I often work with organizations, public, private, philanthropic, that are wrestling with issues such as these and trying to figure out how to promote progressive policies that are in line with everything that we just talked about. And one of the lessons that I've learned in my years of doing that is that in order for things, for concepts such as racial equity to be a part of the way organizations talk, act. They really need to be held as important. They need to be really valued by absolutely everybody in the organization, from, you know, entry-level administrative staff to project managers to board members and executives. So it needs to radiate from the top, and it needs to be valued by absolutely everybody. That's really how, you know, systemic change can really take hold in an organization. And so I guess that's why I would say, you know, coming from my perspective, come back to my hat now as a board member, you know, this is important. I'm not saying it's easy. I don't think any of us are pretending that any of this is easy or that there's any, you know, simple solutions that we could implement in the short term, but it's truly important. So I think the staff members that have decided to take the time out of their already busy workloads to do the work of participating on this committee, because there's going to be some really tough conversations ahead, both internally and externally, to really figure out what it is that we want to do to move forward. So yeah, I appreciate everything everybody has said, and the staff that is taking the time to move this forward. And I particularly want to thank Adriana, who I know is relatively-ish new to her role as in the Office of Public Participation. I think you're doing an excellent job, and, you know, let us know how me as board members can support you in your charge, and we look forward to hearing back on how it's going, because it really is, it's going to be difficult, but it's important. So thanks.
Thank you. I think that talking about race is probably the most painful and the most difficult topic that many of us have tried to do, including me. And for me, when I heard race equity, I thought, okay, how's that going to be different from affirmative action, student affirmative action, parity, blah, blah, blah. So I've been doing this since I was a student back in the day at UC San Diego. But this one, for some reason, really has me filled with hope, because I believe in the values and the moral compass of the governor and the staff that are working on this. The only thing I can tell you is that when I did this with the Clinton administration, it was real clear to me that members of the public rather talk about their sex lives than talking about racism, because it is very difficult to really talk about it in a very honest, meaningful way. It is, I think, a challenge that I'm glad that we're taking, because we need to. Life as we know it has changed, not just because of COVID, but because of Black Lives Matters, and because of the reality that people want a fair shot on all levels. They're tired of that because of the color of their skin or their lack of speaking perfect English or speaking with an accent, that they're seeing less qualified, less than everybody else. And how ironic that it is the water boards that are taking this so seriously, because the water boards has been, in my mind, driven by white males, by nonprofits that are very white privileged, who care about their issues at the expense of many inland communities in EJ neighborhoods. Board Member Saul, I agree with you. We need to put it on the website, but needs to go beyond the website. We need to go into those communities. We need to go into those organizations. We need to go and talk to these permittees, because we have to go to them and not have them try to figure out how to get to us via technology. It doesn't work. As a matter of fact, through my nonprofit, we're teaching women how to get on Zoom in Spanish, so they can have meetings and they can participate in neighborhood councils, and they can come and participate in our meetings. So it is a very painful, difficult conversation from people who've experienced so much racism since they were little girls and little boys. And I think we're all going to need, as said by some of our board members, a lot of courage. Because to be honest, it takes courage. And sometimes you just don't want to say anything because you're thinking, oh no, here we go again. Why is this going to be different from the other initiatives I've been involved with? Well, I have to tell you, this one has given me a lot of hope. And I want to commit to everybody here that I will do what I can, because I'm very good at organizing community in those communities that traditionally get left out for many reasons. I'm very good at that. And I want to commit that I will go to those communities, bring them so they can be part of this conversation, because those are the communities that we really need to hear from. Like, how is our upcoming MS4 permit impacting race equity? I mean, that's the first, I mean, that's our biggest policy we have happening that has impact on all our permittees. There's where we need to start. You know, I have shared with some of you that I've been on the board for 9 years, and I consider my personal and professional failure as a board member that very few people who come and speak before us are lighter or darker shades of brown and black than me. As much as I have tried, I'm going to continue trying that. And many of those communities and individuals don't know what we do. They don't even know we exist, frankly. They really don't. We do all this work, incredible work, impactful work for communities that have no idea it's being done and that they can have a voice and that we want to listen. Just like we did the listening sessions with our permittees, we need to do listening sessions and go out into community and talk to them. I mean, we can, if we want this to be an us thing, we need to get everybody who's involved with us, our partners, our stakeholders, our permittees, our cities, our community-based organizations, those who know about us, those that should know about us, and move forward together. Because a lot of these conversations in the past have been have excluded these folks. And that's the truth. And we want to make sure that whatever policy that we create and whatever resolution we create, it's born out of all of us, all of the folks that are going to be impacted by it, because I think that's very, very important. And, you know, I'm very proud of the work that this water board does. Since I've been on the water board, I've seen such incredible changes when they speak and listen to community of all colors, of all economic levels, that they truly deeply care, that they want to make sure that they hear and that they listen and that they engage. We have come a long ways in the last 9 years. And I think that this is very critical. So we need to really take our time to make sure we do it right and that people feel good about it. And it's very painful. That's all I can tell you. It's very painful. And to try to figure out how not to be angry and scream and shout and carry on, to tell you the truth. You know, according to my laptop, it says my internet connection is unstable, which kind of reflects how I'm feeling right now. So on that note, I do want to thank Ms. Sophie and Ms. Adriana for a very well put presentation to make us start to think about our next steps. Adriana, I've not met you, I've not talked to you, but are we lucky to have you? And Sophie had told me about you and she raved about, you got to meet her. And she was right. So thank you so much for joining us today and putting us on the beginning of this incredible, difficult, rocky path so we can have success. I guess on that note, we're going into executive session. So can we hear from the lawyers as to what will be considered? Ms. Sophie, I think that's on you, or Ms. Adriana, who? Nunez?
Today it's me.
Okay.
I got the lucky straw. For closed session, I'm announcing 15B, 15D, 15N, 15O, 15P, 15Q, and 15R.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Ms. Purdy, how long do you think we will be?
Let's see. I was just checking on that. Sophie and Adriana, do you think that if we plan for an hour, do you think an hour is enough?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. All right.
Okay,
So I would think it's 12:39 now, so perhaps we could be back by 1:45.
okay,